Hello everyone, I'm Professor Geek. Welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to speak to an article that recently appeared in Forbes by Mark Hughes. And this is old news, I'm sure, to many YouTubers who do search for these kinds of things. So I'm not going to go over the entire article. I'm not just going to be somebody else doing that. Other YouTubers have covered the entirety of it quite well. I want to speak to two things in specific that I haven't really heard anybody else address, and it's in terms of argument and in terms of writing. So this article is entitled, Kathleen Kennedy is Still the Best Person to Make Star Wars Movies. So it's clearly going to be an argument for the current Disney Star Wars films. It's going to be an argument for more of the agendas that we've seen in the movies and so forth. The language Hughes uses in this article is highly inflammatory. I tell my students that when you read something, certainly before you write something, but even when you read something, you should try to identify who was the audience for this piece of writing, and then what's the purpose. Every piece of writing has an audience and a purpose, whether the writer knows it or not. And if you understand that as a writer, if you understand who your audience is and what your purpose is, well, then you can make better decisions about stuff like language and tone and structure and all of that. Even in reading something and trying to gain a better understanding of it, if you take the time first to think, who is this person's audience? What is their purpose that they're trying to achieve? Then you can critique it or better understand it, or both. On the surface, given the title and just the surface stated intent of this article, it would seem that it was written to convince people that Kathleen Kennedy is still the right person for the Star Wars movies and that we should continue straight ahead. But let's look at the language that he uses, the word choice, and the overall tone of the article. It's an angry article. Not angry in the sense of screaming and ranting and raving, but in a haughty type of sense. You can tell this from the word choice, like I said, and then the phrasing of the sentences. He talks about rumors surfacing about Kennedy's leaving, and he says, this comes amid rampaging racism, sexism, and other extreme toxic behaviors from a segment of mostly male and mostly white fans who've taken to harassing female actors and artists for existing. Okay, so a lot of assumptions buried there in that sentence, but look at the language as well. Rampaging racism, extreme toxic behavior. These are big, over-the-top, attention-getting words. So you think, okay, well, that was towards the first paragraph or two of the article. Maybe he's just trying to gain that attention. But it continues. Mindless screams of keep your politics out of my entertainment abound from the corner of fandom, ignorant of the most basic facts about what the films say and represent. Later he says, in other words, it's fine to ignore them and not care what they want or what they say and deny them the myopic, whitewashed world they demand. They don't deserve representation of their ideas since their ideas are backward, hateful, and devoid of merit in the first place. If you scream in anger about seeing other people represented, if you harass and insult and threaten marginalized people for daring to exist and to appear in movies, then you and your beliefs have no place in modern storytelling or modern society, except as villains to be defeated and cast aside forever. This is the language. He's obviously very angry, but he's projecting it in a condescending, haughty tone. Who is his audience here, then? We've seen him addressing in the language those evil people who don't like the Star Wars movies in the third person, and then he turned around in that last example that I read and addressed them in the second person. You. I don't think he really knew who his audience was here. Again, on the surface, you might say he's just writing maybe for the average person to convince them that it's only a fringe group of violent, sexist, toxic, quote-unquote, man-babies crying about these movies and that we should just continue on and not worry about them. That might be the surface-level audience, but it's not. If you take into account his language, if you take into account the way he himself changes audiences, shifts in pronouns throughout the article, he wrote this to make himself feel better. He was angered about this phenomenon, and he, instead of going to Twitter, like most people do, and embarrassing themselves with emotional little outbreak posts, he had an outlet at Forbes and decided to write this long article, and Forbes published it. And I say he wrote this for himself to make him feel better because no one is going to read this article and be convinced and come over to his side. Now, people who already agree with him, who already think this, they'll read this article and cheer, and they'll share it around and say, woohoo, see, yeah, take that. But no one is going to read this article and be convinced. Certainly, anybody who has a problem with the Star Wars movies isn't going to appreciate being called a racist, sexist, toxic, whatever. So they're not going to be convinced. He certainly hasn't extended a hand or seat at the table of conversation to any of them. He's mad. He's just wanting to yell at them. But then imagine your average moviegoer who, as I mentioned in my last video, the smugglers, quote unquote, in the metaphor, they're not attached personally to Star Wars. They'll go see movies if they look fun, if they had fun at the last one, and they won't if they didn't. Those are the type of people that you would think maybe he's writing to, but they're not going to be convinced by this either. When you hear somebody this angry and using this much over-the-top language and completely denigrating another side of people, you know that that much emotion does not coexist with logic. It simply doesn't. Even if a person is right, as long as they're ranting and raving, they're not going to be delivering logic. So the person unaffected by all of this, with no reason to be this personally upset at either side, isn't going to suddenly be swayed by this angry name-calling and condescension. No one's going to buy it. So this article is part of this massive pseudo-intellectual circle jerk that's going on in the media right now, pardon my French, but that's basically what we're seeing with the media's response to Solo's failure, to the writing on the wall, as it were, regarding the Kathleen Kennedy Star Wars days and universe here. It's an interesting cultural phenomenon to see. The second thing I want to mention in this article is the specific sentence. I read a little bit of it a second ago, but his logic here. He says, "Mindless screams of 'keep your politics out of my entertainment' abound from that corner of fandom, ignorant of the most basic facts about what the film says and represents. The Empire's design and titles were heavily influenced by fascism and Nazi imagery. The Ewok uprising was a veiled commentary about the Vietnam War, and the entire concept is about rebelling against authoritarianism and fighting back against oppression and slavery." Alright, so the assumption here is that anybody who doesn't want politics preached to them from a Star Wars film is ignorant and doesn't understand the basic facts of the Star Wars universe, including the original trilogy. That's quite a claim, so let's look at his examples here. The Empire's design heavily influenced by fascism and Nazi imagery. Sure, okay. Was a Nazi regime going on in the late 70s and 80s? No, it wasn't. So the original trilogy, through the Empire's imagery and designs and whatnot, was in no way directly preaching about anything current in politics. It was speaking to an idea. It was doing what mythology should do, which is to recontextualize something in our real life, something in our real world, and a tendency that many governments and many people have. It recontextualizes that in a fantasy setting and helps us consider it in a new light, to come to new realizations about it. That was fine. Nothing preachy about that. That was doing the work of mythology. Let's see his next example. The Ewok uprising was a veiled commentary about the Vietnam War. That's a pretty reductionist statement. The entire inclusion, the entire story of the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi was a veiled commentary about the Vietnam War. What commentary could it have made? There was no direct correlations. Now, there's obviously connections to be made, of course. But what commentary, what direct preaching statement could it have been making? That America shouldn't be involved in Vietnam because we shouldn't be enforcing our will on an indigenous people who knows the terrain better anyway, and so forth? Well, the Return of the Jedi certainly didn't make that claim, because the rebellion and the alliance goes to Endor, and with the Ewoks' help, liberates them. So that can't be any kind of direct commentary. You can't reduce the Ewoks or any facet of that original trilogy to any one political principle, because it wasn't there to preach. It was there to do the work of mythology, to entertain and to recontextualize these things in our real world in a different setting, in ways that enable us to think about them on different levels and to gain new truths or new ways of considering them. That's the work of mythology. Now let's compare that to what the Disney Star Wars films have done. The Disney Star Wars movies, they don't recontextualize these things within a mythic setting. They directly preach about certain issues, often and usually always to the detriment of the actual plot. So there's no weaving into the entertainment there. They actually stop the story many times so they can preach this message, and then they'll pick it up. We see this in The Force Awakens for one small example. When Finn first meets Rey and they are running from the New Order ships that are attacking, Finn grabs Rey's hand as they start to run, and Rey stops him and says, "Don't grab my hand. I can run by myself." Okay, that's fine. Rey's a strong, independent woman. We've seen what she's capable of. Sure, that's fine. Nice little moment. Let's move on. But the film stops and repeats that. J.J. Abrams makes sure to repeat that at least 3 times, I think it was. We get it. Sister can do it for herself. Okay, we get it. Can we please run from the New Order now? Can we stick with the tension in the moment and the actual plot of the story? Stop halting everything just to preach to us and make sure we understand that men shouldn't be grabbing a woman's hand and assuming that they need protection and so forth. That is a story halting moment just to preach. And that's a small, subtle example. I could give you bigger ones, but let's keep on moving. Let's go to The Last Jedi. The entire plot grinds to a halt so that Finn and Tico can liberate some animals on a gambling planet. The entire story, there's no reason for that. There are no themes of that planted earlier in the film to be realized in that moment. It's as though Rian Johnson says, stop, guys. I want to get a message across here. Okay, there we go. Got my message. All right, now let's get back to the stakes and the tension and the development of the story. That is not recontextualizing of a real-world struggle or a real-world phenomena. Yes, Star Wars and any mythology should speak to our real-world struggles. It should speak to things like government and cultural struggles and whatnot, but it should do so organically in a way that naturally arises from the story, and it should do so in a way that recontextualizes these struggles so that our galaxy a long, long time ago and far, far away isn't pointing out specific things that are going on in our real world. When you create a mythology and it does this work, it embeds itself into the public consciousness, and then it becomes the public's. It's no longer a certain person's or a studio's or whatever. A great example of this is that George Lucas wrote this wonderful original trilogy, and he made it with the help that he had then, and it set into the public consciousness, and it became part of our mythology, so much so that when he came back and did the prequels, they didn't even fit very well because he was assuming that direct control. No, this is my baby and I'm going to raise it exactly how I want. To an extent, nowhere near the extent that Disney has done, but he did that even to the point of forcing his own politics into that prequel. Anakin quoting George Bush and the Emperor taking over the Republic in a way that people loved to talk about back then as echoing the Bush administration. No one likes to talk about it after Obama took over and didn't relinquish any of the power, because that didn't suit the agenda, the narrative. Mark Hughes talks a lot about the people who don't like these Star Wars movies. They just wanted their politics portrayed in the film instead of these. No, open your mind. It's much bigger than this. It's not about whose politics to portray. It's about going in at an even more foundational level. Let's dig through all of this left versus right, false binary nonsense in the media. Let's dig into the foundation of these issues. Let's represent that to the viewer or reader or whatever in a new way that helps us to draw new conclusions and maybe come together in ways that we couldn't have before, just fighting from our dug-in sides. That is mythology. So this article, I don't want to resort to the language and to the tones that he was using, but this article is not thought out. It's not an educated article. It's an emotional reaction to a cultural moment. So I wanted to come at this article from a writing perspective, digging a little bit to the logic there, going into the mythological principles and guidelines as my channel specializes in. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think about these approaches that are presented through the media right now. And what do you think about reading a lot of these tweets or articles in terms of who is their audience? What are the chances they're actually going to convince anybody the way they're approaching the subject with their languages and tones and so forth? It's something that not a lot of people think about. I will be returning tomorrow with another video. Hopefully, I'm working on one about some mythic constructs we see throughout mythology and certainly throughout comic books and cartoons. And I want to talk a little bit about some specifics of that. I want to talk about some more 80s cartoons. I've been doing some research, more research on my beloved He-Man, of course, and G.I. Joe and so forth. So I will return with all of that as I can. Thank you to all the new subscribers. We are so close to 1,000. I really appreciate everyone who's been sharing, liking, and subscribing. So please keep that up. We will make 1,000 eventually, and then I will start some live stream film and graphic novel reviews and analyses. That'll be a lot of fun. So thank you for the support. Please keep it up. And until next time, keep enjoying and digging deeper into the hero stories you love. Thanks for watching.